The wind howled through Wind River Mountains like a wounded animal, its icy fingers clawing at the canvas of the abandoned covered wagon. Inside, a young mother pressed her body against the rough wooden floor, shielding not just her 3-year-old son, but 2 tiny wolf cubs that whimpered against her chest. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage on her shoulder where Samuel Drake's bullet had found its mark. They had left her here to die, calling her a curse, a burden, a widow who brought nothing but misfortune to their wagon train. But Eleanor Whitman refused to surrender to the storm or to the darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. As the blizzard raged and her strength faded, she whispered prayers into the frozen air, never knowing that somewhere in those merciless mountains, a Shoshone guide named Joseph Two Feathers was following a trail of broken promises and shattered humanity that would lead him to a sight that would change everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between human and wild, between mercy and survival, between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory of 1872 was a land of breathtaking beauty and unforgiving trials. The Wind River Mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the sky, their peaks crowned with snow even in the warmest months. In the shadow of these giants, wagon trains crawled westward like lines of ants, carrying dreams of new beginnings and better lives. The valleys between the mountains held secrets older than memory, places where the Shoshone people had walked for generations, reading the land like a sacred book. Eagles Peak Valley stretched for miles, bordered by forests of lodgepole pine and stands of quaking aspen that turned gold in autumn. The valley floor was carpeted with sagebrush and wildflowers in summer, but by October the flowers had long since withered, and the first snows dusted the higher elevations. Broken Arrow Pass cut through the mountains like a jagged wound, its narrow passages treacherous even in good weather. When storms came, the pass became a death trap for the unprepared. The wagon train had been traveling for 5 months when they reached the foothills of the Wind River Range. 23 wagons in all, led by Samuel Drake, a man whose weathered face bore the marks of countless journeys across the frontier. Drake was known for his efficiency and his iron will, qualities that had earned him the position of wagon master. But efficiency often came at the cost of compassion, and Drake had little patience for those who couldn't keep pace. Among the travelers was Eleanor Whitman, a young widow whose husband Henry had died of fever 6 months earlier in Independence, Missouri. She had sold everything to buy a place on the wagon train, determined to reach Oregon, where Henry's brother had promised them land. At 24, she possessed a quiet strength that belied her delicate appearance. Her dark hair was usually tucked beneath a simple bonnet, and her green eyes held a mixture of sorrow and determination that made others uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite explain. Eleanor's son James was a bright child with his father's sandy hair and his mother's observant nature. At 3 years old, he had already learned to read the moods of the adults around him, becoming quiet when tensions rose and staying close to his mother's skirts when the other children played too roughly. The boy had a gentle soul, often collecting smooth stones or interesting leaves to show his mother, finding wonder in small things while the adults worried about larger concerns. The wagon train had established a rigid hierarchy, with the wealthier families commanding respect and better positions in the line. Cornelius Moore, a merchant from Boston, traveled with 3 wagons full of goods he planned to sell in Oregon. His voice carried weight in the nightly councils, and his opinions shaped many of the group's decisions. Moore viewed the journey as a business venture, calculating risks and benefits with the cold precision of a ledger book. Margaret Foster, a grandmother traveling west to join her daughter's family, was one of the few who showed kindness to Eleanor. At 68, Margaret had buried 2 husbands and raised 5 children. She understood grief and loneliness in ways that the younger women didn't. Her wagon was modest but well supplied, and she often shared her evening meal with Eleanor and James, ignoring the disapproving looks from others. Dr. William Hayes served as the train's physician. Though his skills were limited by the supplies he could carry. A learned man from Philadelphia, he had come west seeking adventure, but found instead the harsh realities of frontier medicine. Hayes was methodical and caring, but he struggled with the superstitions and prejudices that influenced many medical decisions on the trail. Reverend Paul Carson provided spiritual guidance to the group, conducting Sunday services and presiding over the 2 frequent burials along the trail. He was a young man, fresh from seminary, whose faith had yet to be tested by the extremes of human nature he would witness on the journey. Carson believed deeply in the power of community and the importance of caring for the least among them, though his voice often went unheard in practical matters. Alice Drake, Samuel's daughter, was 17 and possessed a compassionate heart that seemed at odds with her father's harsh pragmatism. She had befriended Eleanor early in the journey, drawn to the young widow's quiet dignity. Alice often helped with James when Eleanor was busy with the endless chores required to keep their small wagon moving forward. The tension surrounding Eleanor had been building for weeks. It started with small things like whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, meaningful glances exchanged when misfortune struck the train, when the Hendersons' oxen died mysteriously, when the river crossing claimed the Bailey's wagon, when fever struck the Murphy children. Fingers began to point in Eleanor's direction. She was a widow, traveling alone, and in the superstitious minds of some, this marked her as unlucky or worse. Samuel Drake did nothing to discourage these whispers. In his mind, Eleanor represented disorder, a break in the natural pattern of families traveling together. Her presence made him uncomfortable in ways he wouldn't admit, perhaps because she reminded him of his own wife who had died years earlier, or perhaps because her independence challenged his authority in subtle ways. The morning of October 15th dawned clear but cold, with a bite in the air that promised winter's approach. The wagon train had camped at the base of Broken Arrow Pass, preparing for what Drake assured them would be a 2-day crossing. The pass was notorious among travelers, its narrow trails and sudden weather changes claiming wagons every year. But Drake was confident in his timing, dismissing the concerns raised by some of the more experienced travelers. Joseph Two Feathers watched the wagon train from a ridge overlooking their camp. He had been tracking them for 3 days, not out of any hostile intent, but because it was his nature to know who moved through his people's lands. At 35, Joseph was one of the most respected guides in the territory, known equally for his skill in reading the land and his ability to navigate between the world of his Shoshone people and the increasing presence of white settlers. Joseph's face bore the weathered look of someone who had spent his life outdoors, with deep-set dark eyes that missed nothing and black hair worn long in the traditional way. He moved through the mountains like a shadow, his knowledge of every trail and hidden spring passed down through generations. His wife, Mary Singing Bird, often teased him about his solitary wanderings, but she understood his need to maintain the connection with the land that defined who he was. The Shoshone had watched many wagon trains pass through their territory, some with respect for the land and its people, others with arrogance and destruction in their wake. Joseph had learned to read the character of these groups from a distance, noting how they treated their animals, how they managed their resources, how they dealt with the weakest among them. This train troubled him, though he couldn't quite say why. As the morning progressed, Joseph noticed unusual activity in the camp. Raised voices carried on the wind, and people gathered in animated groups. He moved closer, using a stand of pines for cover, his practiced feet making no sound on the forest floor. Through his field glasses, a gift from an army officer he had once guided, Joseph watched as an argument escalated near one of the smaller wagons. Eleanor stood with James clutched. To her side, facing a group of men led by Samuel Drake. Cornelius Moore was there too, his round face flushed with indignation. Other members of the wagon train had formed a loose circle, some looking uncomfortable, others nodding in agreement with whatever Drake was saying. Margaret Foster stood near Eleanor, her aged frame straight with defiance, but her voice was lost. In the angry chorus, the argument reached a crescendo when Drake pointed toward the mountains, then back at Eleanor. Joseph couldn't hear the words, but the gestures were clear enough. They were casting her out. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He had seen this before, the way groups could turn on their own when fear took hold. It was a peculiarly human cruelty, one that always puzzled him. In the animal world, the pack protected its weakest members. Only humans seemed capable of abandoning their own to fate. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, gesturing animatedly, clearly protesting the decision. Reverend Carson added his voice to the doctor's, holding his Bible aloft as if its weight could tip the scales of the argument. But the tide had turned against Eleanor, and no amount of reasoning or scripture could reverse it. The crowd's mood had shifted to something ugly and dangerous, fed by weeks of suspicion and misfortune. Then, Drake did something that made Joseph's blood run cold. The wagon master drew his pistol, not pointing it directly at Eleanor but holding it in a way that made his intentions clear. The crowd stepped back, creating a wider circle around the young mother and her child. Eleanor's face had gone pale, but she stood straight, her chin lifted in defiance, even as her arm tightened around James. The boy began to cry, the sound cutting through the morning air like a knife. It was a child's innocent terror at the anger. Surrounding them, the incomprehension of why these people who had traveled with them for months had suddenly become strangers, with hard faces and harder hearts. Eleanor knelt beside her son, whispering comfort even as her own situation grew more desperate. Alice Drake pushed through the crowd, reaching for her father's arm. Joseph could see her pleading with him, tears streaming down her young face. But Samuel Drake shook her off, his decision made. He gestured to several men who reluctantly moved forward to Eleanor's wagon. They began unhitching her oxen, their movements quick and efficient, despite the obvious discomfort some of them felt. Margaret Foster made one last attempt to intervene, placing herself between Eleanor and the men. But at her age, she was easily moved aside, though not roughly. Even in their cruelty, they maintained some pretense of civilization. Dr. Hayes turned away in disgust, while Reverend Carson continued to argue, his voice growing hoarse with the effort. Within an hour, Eleanor's wagon had been separated from the train and positioned at the edge of the camp. They left her one ox, the older and weaker of her team, along with minimal supplies. It was a death sentence disguised as mercy, and everyone knew it. The pass was treacherous enough with a full team and experienced guides. For a woman alone, with a small child and an old ox, it was virtually impossible. As the wagon train prepared to move out, Eleanor stood beside her isolated wagon, James clinging to her skirts. She didn't plead or cry, maintaining a dignity that seemed to shame some of the onlookers. Margaret Foster broke ranks one last time, hurrying over to press a small bundle into Eleanor's hands. The old woman embraced her briefly, whispering something before being called back to the train. Joseph watched as the wagon train slowly moved away, leaving Eleanor and her son standing alone in the vast wilderness. The mountains loomed around them, beautiful but indifferent to human drama. He had witnessed many injustices in his life, but something about this abandonment stirred a deep anger within him. Perhaps it was the child's tears, or the mother's proud stance in the face of certain doom. Perhaps it was simply that he had daughters of his own and couldn't imagine them facing such cruelty. As the last wagon disappeared around a bend, Eleanor, finally allowed her shoulders to slump. She gathered James into her arms, holding him close as she surveyed their situation. Joseph could see her lips moving, whether in prayer or simply talking to her son. He couldn't tell. Then she straightened, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and began to prepare for whatever came next. Joseph settled back into the shadows, his mind already calculating. He knew the storm that was coming, could feel it in the air and see it in the way the clouds gathered around the peaks. The wagon train, in their haste to rid themselves of their perceived curse, had missed the signs. They would be caught in the pass when the blizzard hit, but they had numbers and supplies to see them through. Eleanor and her boy had neither. He thought of his own wife and children, safe in their village. He thought of the teachings of his grandfather, who had always said that the true measure of a man was not in his strength, but in his mercy. He thought of the sacred wolves that roamed these mountains, creatures his people revered as teachers and guides, and he thought of the choice that lay before him now. The wind began to pick up, rustling through the pines with a sound like whispered warnings. Joseph made his decision. He would watch and wait, and when the time came, he would act. But for now, he needed to see what this woman was made of, whether she had the spirit to survive what was coming. The mountains had their own way of testing people, and that test was about to begin. Eleanor set about her tasks with methodical determination. She checked their supplies, such as they were, and began to secure everything in the wagon. She spoke, constantly to James, her voice calm and reassuring despite the fear Joseph could see in her movements. The old ox stood patiently, as if understanding that their survival now depended on cooperation. The first snowflakes began to fall as the sun reached its zenith, large and lazy at first, then smaller and more insistent. Eleanor looked up at the sky, her face grave. She knew what was coming, just as Joseph did. The question was whether she would try to follow the wagon train into the pass or seek shelter where she was. Either choice carried its own risks. Joseph moved silently through the forest, positioning himself where he could better observe her. Decisions. He had already spotted a sheltered grove not far from Eleanor's position, a place where the trees grew thick and a small overhang of rock provided protection from the worst of the weather. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than remaining in the open or attempting the pass in a blizzard. As the snowfall intensified, Eleanor made her choice. Instead of following the wagon train's tracks, she began to guide the ox and wagon toward the tree line. It was the smarter decision, though Joseph wondered if she knew about the grove or was simply following instinct. Either way, it showed she had some wilderness sense, which improved her chances of survival. The wind grew stronger, driving the snow in horizontal sheets that reduced visibility to mere yards. Eleanor struggled with the ox, which balked at moving into the wind. James had retreated inside the wagon, his small face peering out through the canvas opening. Joseph could see Eleanor's lips moving constantly, whether encouraging the ox or praying. He couldn't tell. Then disaster struck. A strong gust of wind caught the wagon's canvas, and the already stressed ox stumbled. The wagon tilted dangerously, and Joseph heard the crack of wood breaking. Eleanor cried out, rushing to steady the wagon, but it was too late. One of the wheels had struck a hidden rock, and the axle had snapped. Joseph tensed, ready to reveal himself and offer help, but something held him back. He watched as Eleanor stood in the driving snow, staring at the broken wagon. Her shoulders shook, whether from cold or despair, he couldn't tell. Then James appeared at the wagon opening, his small voice carried on the wind. "Mama?" That single word seemed to galvanize Eleanor. She reached up and lifted her son down from the wagon, wrapping him in her own coat despite the cold. Then she began to quickly sort through their supplies, selecting only what they could carry. Joseph nodded approvingly. She was thinking clearly, Not wasting time on what couldn't be saved, the ox, freed from its burden, stood uncertainly in the snow. Eleanor took its lead rope and began moving toward the trees, carrying James and dragging a bundle of supplies. Her progress was slow, but she was moving in the right direction. Joseph shadowed her movement, staying hidden but ready to intervene. If necessary, that's when he heard it, a low growl carried on the wind. Joseph froze, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. Wolves. Not the spirit wolves of his people's stories, but real predators drawn by the scent of distress. He spotted them through the snow, 3 shapes moving parallel to Eleanor's path. Eleanor heard them too. She stopped, clutching James tighter, her free hand fumbling for something in her bundle. Joseph saw her pull out a pistol, probably her late husband's, and hold it with shaking hands. She knew enough to keep moving, not to run, but to maintain a steady pace toward the trees. The wolves kept pace, patient hunters waiting for the right moment. Joseph knew they were more interested in the ox than the humans, but fear could make them unpredictable. He began to move closer, still keeping to cover but positioning himself to intervene. Then he saw something that made him pause, a 4th wolf, smaller than the others, limping through the snow. It was a female, and from the way she moved, Joseph could tell she was nursing. This wasn't just a hunting pack, it was a family group with cubs somewhere nearby. The situation had just become much more complicated. Eleanor reached the edge of the grove, just as the storm reached its full fury. She found partial shelter under a large pine and set James down, keeping him pressed against the trunk. The ox stood nearby, its head lowered against the wind. The wolves circled at a distance, visible only as shadows in the white world. Joseph watched Eleanor build a small shelter using pine boughs and the canvas she had salvaged from the wagon. Her movements were efficient despite the cold, and she kept James involved in the task, giving him small jobs to keep his mind off their danger. It was something a mother would do, focusing on the immediate needs while pushing down her own fear. As darkness began to fall, the temperature plummeted further. Joseph knew that without fire, Eleanor and her son wouldn't survive the night. He watched her gather dry wood from under the protected sides of trees, her movements becoming sluggish as the cold sapped her strength. She managed to get a small fire started using matches from her supplies, the flames struggling against the wind but providing precious warmth. The wolves had settled into waiting positions around the grove, their eyes reflecting the firelight when the wind cleared the snow momentarily. The injured female had disappeared, presumably returning to her cubs. Joseph realized with growing concern that the cubs must be nearby, possibly in a den within the grove itself. As if confirming his thoughts, he heard a faint whimpering carried on the wind, not human crying, but the distinctive sound of wolf cubs in distress. The sound came from deeper in the grove, where a jumble of rocks created natural shelters. The female must have denned there, and now, weakened by injury and unable to hunt, she couldn't return to her cubs. Eleanor heard it too. She looked up from tending the fire, her head tilted as she listened. James had fallen asleep in her arms, exhausted by fear and cold. For a long moment she sat still, the conflict clear on her face even in the dim light. Then she carefully laid James down, covering him with every spare piece of clothing she had, and picked up a burning branch from the fire. Joseph tensed as she moved deeper into the grove, following the sound of the whimpering. This was either very brave or very foolish, possibly both. The other wolves watched her movement but didn't follow, their attention still on the ox. Joseph moved silently after her, ready to act if the situation turned dangerous. Eleanor found the den among the rocks, a small opening barely visible in the snow. The whimpering was louder here, desperate and weak. She hesitated at the entrance, then did something that surprised even Joseph. She left the burning branch planted in the snow and got down on her hands and knees, crawling partway into the den. Joseph heard her gasp, Then her voice soft and wondering, "Oh, you poor things." She emerged backward, and in her arms were two wolf cubs, so young their eyes were barely open. They were thin and weak, clearly starving without their mother's care. The injured female hadn't returned to the den in at least a day, maybe more. Eleanor looked at the cubs, then back toward where James slept, then down at the small lives in her arms. Joseph could see the moment she made her decision. She tucked the cubs inside her coat and made her way back to their makeshift shelter. The other wolves watched, but made no move to stop her, their attention diverted by the ox's distress. Back at the shelter, Eleanor settled the cubs next to James, sharing what little warmth they had. She melted snow in a tin cup and tried to get the cubs to drink, her movements gentle despite her own exhaustion. Joseph watched in amazement as she tore strips from her own petticoat to clean them, talking softly all the while. The storm raged through the night, piling snow against their shelter. Eleanor kept the fire going, though her wood supply dwindled. She dozed fitfully, starting awake every time the wind gusted particularly hard or the wolves howled. The cubs whimpered occasionally, and she would soothe them just as she did James, with soft words and gentle touches. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to grey. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried in white. Eleanor emerged from the shelter, moving stiffly after the long, cold night. James still slept, curled around the wolf cubs as if they were puppies. The ox had survived the night, though it stood with its head low, exhausted. That's when Eleanor noticed the blood in the snow. A trail led from their shelter toward the main path, and her face went pale as she recognized what it meant. During the night, probably while trying to rejoin the wagon train, she had been shot. The wound wasn't immediately visible under her heavy clothing, but the blood trail told its own story. Joseph had been so focused on watching her care for the children and cubs that he had missed her injury. Now he could see the way she favored. Her left side, the careful way she moved to avoid jarring whatever wound she was hiding. She was hurt, possibly badly, and still she had spent the night caring for others. The adult wolves had vanished with the storm, including the injured female. Whether they had moved on or were simply watching from a distance, Joseph couldn't tell, but their absence gave him the opportunity he needed. It was time to make his presence known. He stepped out from the trees, moving slowly and deliberately, so as not to startle her. Eleanor spun at the sound, reaching for the pistol she had kept close all night. But when she saw him, something in his demeanor must have reassured her, because she lowered the weapon, though she didn't put it away entirely. Joseph raised his hand in the universal sign of peace, then spoke in English, his voice carrying the soft accent of his people. "I mean you no harm. I have been watching. You need help." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her green eyes wary but not hostile. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. "Are you with them? The wagon train?" Joseph shook his head. "I am Joseph Two Feathers of the Shoshone people. I saw what they did to you." He gestured toward the blood in the snow. "You are hurt." Eleanor's hand moved involuntarily to her side, and she winced. "It's nothing, just a graze." But even as she spoke, Joseph could see the truth in the way she swayed slightly, the pallor of her skin. "You saved the wolf cubs," Joseph said, moving closer, "even when you yourself were injured. This is unexpected." A ghost of a smile crossed Eleanor's face. "They were dying. I couldn't just leave them." She glanced back at the shelter, where James still slept. "I know what it's like to be abandoned." Joseph nodded slowly. "The mother wolf is dead. Hunters from your wagon train killed her yesterday before the storm. These cubs would have starved without you." Eleanor's face hardened. "They seem to have a talent for leaving the helpless to die." "Yes," Joseph agreed, "but not everyone shares their cruelty. May I look at your wound?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. Joseph approached carefully, noting how she kept herself between him and the shelter where James and the cubs slept. A protective mother, even wounded and exhausted. He respected that. The wound was worse than Eleanor had admitted. Drake's bullet had caught her in the shoulder, and while it had passed through cleanly, the blood loss was significant. Joseph's experienced eye could see the signs of fever beginning, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of more than just cold. As he examined the wound, Eleanor told him what had happened, how the wagon train had blamed her for every misfortune, how Drake had finally convinced them she was a curse that needed to be cut away, how he had fired the shot as a warning when she tried to follow them, but his aim had been off, or perhaps not. He meant to wound, not kill, Joseph said, cleaning the injury with snow, to make sure you couldn't follow but leave his conscience clear of murder. Eleanor laughed bitterly. How charitable of him. James woke then, sitting up in alarm when he saw the stranger. But Eleanor's calm voice soothed him, and soon he was watching Joseph with the frank curiosity of childhood. The wolf cubs stirred, two mewling weakly. "Mama," James said, "the puppies are hungry." Eleanor and Joseph exchanged a look over the child's head. "Yes," she said softly, "they are." Joseph made his decision then, fully and completely. "I know a place," he said, "a sheltered valley not far from here. My people sometimes winter there. There is food, warmth, safety, but the journey is difficult, especially for one who is wounded. And if I stay here..." Joseph looked at the sky, reading the weather signs. Another storm comes tonight, worse than the last. He didn't need to say more. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with renewed determination. "Then we go, all of us." She looked down at the cubs. "I won't leave them. They've lost enough." Joseph nodded, unsurprised. He had seen the strength in her, the kind that came not from muscle but from spirit. The ox cannot make the journey. The path is too narrow, too steep. We must go on foot. "Then we go on foot," Eleanor said simply. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow as Joseph Two Feathers fashioned a makeshift travois from pine branches and salvaged canvas. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, weaving strips of leather and fabric to create a sturdy frame that could carry their supplies. Eleanor watched him work while she prepared what little they could take, her movements careful and deliberate to avoid aggravating her wound. James had taken to the wolf cubs with the innocent acceptance of childhood, carefully cradling them while his mother sorted through their remaining provisions. The cubs, though weak, responded to his gentle touch, their small bodies pressed against his warmth. Joseph observed this interaction with interest, noting how naturally the boy handled the wild creatures, as if recognizing kindred spirits in need of protection. "We must leave soon," Joseph said, testing the strength of the travois. "The weather holds for now, but clouds gather beyond Eagle's Peak. By midday, the wind will shift." Eleanor nodded, wrapping dried meat and hardtack in cloth. Her face was pale, and Joseph could see the effort it took for her to remain standing. The fever had taken hold during the night, though she tried to hide it. He had seen enough wounded warriors to recognize the signs of infection beginning its insidious work. "How far is this valley?" she asked, securing a water skin to the travois. "Half a day's journey for one who is strong and unburdened," Joseph replied honestly. "For us, perhaps longer." The path winds through Broken Arrow Canyon, then climbs to Whispering Pines Ridge before descending into the valley. There are places to rest, but we cannot linger. Eleanor absorbed this information silently, calculating their chances. Joseph appreciated that she didn't waste energy on false optimism or complaints. She simply accepted the reality and prepared to face it. This pragmatism would serve them well in the hours ahead. They set out as the sun climbed higher, leaving the abandoned wagon and the patient ox behind. Joseph had removed the animal's harness and pointed it toward lower ground where it might find shelter and forage. Whether it survived or not would depend on its own instincts and fortune. Joseph led the way, pulling the travois through the snow, while Eleanor followed with James. She had fashioned a sling from her shawl to carry the wolf cubs against her chest, keeping them warm while leaving, her hands free to steady herself. James walked between them, his small legs working hard to match their pace. The first mile passed in relative ease, following a natural path through the trees that offered protection from the wind. Joseph chose their route carefully, avoiding deeper drifts and unstable ground. He spoke occasionally, pointing out landmarks or explaining the significance of certain formations, his voice calm and educational. "See how the snow lies differently on that ridge?" he said, gesturing toward a distant slope. "The wind patterns tell us which passes will be clear and which will be blocked. My grandfather taught me to read these signs when I was younger than your boy." Eleanor listened with genuine interest, filing away each piece of information. She understood that Joseph was not merely making conversation, but sharing survival knowledge that might prove crucial. Her respect for him grew with each observation, recognizing the depth of understanding that came from generations of living in harmony with this land. As they climbed higher, the terrain became more challenging. The path narrowed, winding between massive boulders and fallen trees. James began to tire, his steps faltering. Without being asked, Joseph stopped and lifted the boy onto the travois, arranging the supplies to create a secure nest for him. "Rest now, small warrior," he said gently. "Save your strength for later." James looked to his mother for permission, and at her nod, settled gratefully among the bundles. The wolf cubs whimpered at the separation, and Eleanor soothed them with soft words and gentle strokes through the fabric of the sling. The climb to Whispering Pines Ridge tested Eleanor's endurance to its limits. The path grew steeper, switching back and forth across the mountainside. Each step jarred her wounded shoulder, sending spikes of pain through her body. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold, and her breathing became labored. Joseph monitored her condition without seeming to, adjusting their pace and finding reasons to pause that wouldn't wound her pride. He pointed out a golden eagle, circling overhead, explained how his people used certain plants for medicine, described the different types of snow and what each meant for travelers. "In my language," he said during one such pause, "we have many words for snow. This kind, light, and dry we call walking snow because it doesn't cling to your feet. But the snow that comes tonight will be standing snow, heavy and wet, impossible to travel through." Eleanor leaned against a boulder, catching her breath. "Your language. It sounds beautiful, like the wind through the pines." Joseph smiled slightly. "My wife says our words are carved by the mountains and polished by the streams. Each sound has meaning beyond its meaning." He glanced at the sky. "We must continue. The ridge is near." The final ascent to Whispering Pines Ridge proved the most difficult. The path became little more than a game trail, winding between ancient pines whose branches created a twilight world beneath their canopy. Eleanor stumbled frequently now, her strength fading with each step. Joseph could see her fighting to remain, conscious, driven by sheer willpower and maternal instinct. When they finally crested the ridge, the view that greeted them was both magnificent and daunting. The land fell away in a series of forested slopes and hidden valleys, with the silver thread of a river visible far below. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks lost in gathering clouds. The wind that gave the ridge its name sighed through the pine branches with an almost musical quality. Joseph allowed them a brief rest, sharing water and dried berries from his supplies. Eleanor fed small pieces of meat to the wolf cubs, who seemed stronger after the warmth of the journey. James had fallen asleep on the travois, exhausted by the morning's ordeal. "The descent is easier," Joseph said, studying Eleanor's face, "but also more dangerous. The path is narrow with loose stones. You must tell me if you need to stop." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I can make it. For James. For all of them." She gestured to include the sleeping cubs. "They're counting. On me?" Joseph nodded, recognizing the iron will that had kept her alive this long. But he also saw how her hands trembled, how she favored her wounded side more pronouncedly. The infection was spreading. He could smell it now, that sweet, sick scent that meant time was running short. The descent proved as treacherous as Joseph had warned. The path switched back down the mountain face, sometimes barely wide enough for the travois. Loose rocks skittered over precipitous drops, and patches of ice lurked beneath the snow. Joseph moved with extra caution, testing each step before committing his weight. Eleanor followed in his footsteps, using a walking stick he had cut for her. Several times she slipped, catching herself with gasps of pain that she tried to muffle. The cubs stirred restlessly in their sling, sensing her distress. But she pressed on, fixed on Joseph's steady figure ahead. Halfway down, disaster nearly struck. Eleanor's foot found a patch of ice hidden beneath loose snow. She went down hard, sliding toward the edge of the path where the mountainside fell. Away into empty space. Joseph reacted instantly, dropping the travois handles and lunging backward to catch her arm. For a heart-stopping moment, they teetered on the brink, Eleanor's weight pulling them both toward the void. Then Joseph found his footing, muscles straining as he hauled her back to safety. They collapsed together on the path, breathing hard, while James stirred and whimpered in his sleep. "Thank you," Eleanor gasped, her good hand clutching his arm. Joseph helped her sit up, assessing the damage. Her fall had reopened the bullet wound, fresh blood seeping through her clothing. The fever burned brighter in her eyes now, and he knew they were running out of time. "We're close," he said, helping her to her feet. "Another hour, perhaps less." "Can you continue?" Eleanor nodded. Though Joseph could see the effort it cost her, they resumed their descent, moving even more carefully now. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows that made footing uncertain. Behind them, the clouds, Joseph had been watching all day, began to mass around the peaks. They reached the valley floor as the light began to fade. Here, the trees grew thicker, a mixture of pine, aspen, and cottonwood that created natural windbreaks. A stream gurgled beneath a thin shell of ice, its music adding to the whisper of wind through branches. Joseph led them along the water's edge, following a path worn by generations of animals and humans alike. The sheltered valley he had spoken of revealed itself gradually, opening like a cupped hand in the mountain's embrace. Steep walls rose on three sides, creating a natural fortress against storms. The fourth side faced south, allowing sunlight to penetrate even in winter. At the valley's heart, a grove of ancient cottonwoods surrounded a natural hot spring that kept the immediate area warmer than the surrounding wilderness. Joseph's people had used this place for countless generations, though not as a permanent settlement. Stone circles marked old fire pits, and carved symbols on certain trees told stories for those who could read them. A small cave in the valley's western wall had been improved over the years. Its entrance widened and interior smoothed to create an emergency shelter. "Here," Joseph said, guiding them toward the cave. "This place has sheltered my people through many storms." The cave was larger than it appeared from outside, extending back into the hillside in a series of connected chambers. The entrance chamber was perhaps 20 feet deep and nearly as wide, with a smoke hole carefully carved through the rock above. Dry wood had been stacked against one wall, along with other supplies cached by previous visitors. Joseph quickly built a fire, while Eleanor collapsed against the cave wall, finally allowing her exhaustion to show. James woke fully now, taking in their new surroundings with wide eyes. The wolf cubs stirred in their sling, mewling weakly. "Mama," James said, his small voice uncertain. "We're safe now, sweetheart," Eleanor managed, though Joseph could see the effort each word cost her. "This nice man has brought us to a warm place." Joseph had water heating over the fire and began preparing a tea from plants he pulled from a leather pouch. The mixture included willow bark for fever and pain, along with other herbs his grandmother had taught him to use. He brought the steaming cup to Eleanor, helping her drink when her hands shook too badly to hold it steady. "You must let me tend your wound properly now," he said. "The infection spreads. Without treatment, you will not see another sunrise." Eleanor met his eyes, understanding the gravity of his words. She nodded, then looked at James. "Can you be very brave and help Mr. Two Feathers? The puppies need someone to keep them warm while he helps Mama get better." James nodded solemnly, accepting the responsibility. Joseph carefully transferred the wolf cubs to the boy's lap, showing him how to hold them gently. The cubs, perhaps, sensing safety at last, settled against the child's warmth. With James occupied, Joseph turned his attention to Eleanor's wound. The bullet had passed through cleanly, but the combination of cold, exhaustion, and lack of proper treatment had allowed infection to take hold. The flesh around the entry and exit wounds was angry red, with dark streaks beginning to spread outward. Joseph worked methodically, cleaning the wound with water he had boiled and cooled, then applying a poultice of herbs. Eleanor bit down on a piece of leather to keep from crying out, not wanting to frighten James. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and several times Joseph thought she might faint, but she held on with remarkable fortitude. "Your strength honors you," he said quietly as he bandaged the wound with strips of clean cloth from his pack. "Many warriors would have fallen long before this." Eleanor managed a weak smile. Warriors don't usually have 3-year-olds depending on them. It's amazing what mothers can endure when their children need them. Joseph prepared a sleeping draught, mixing herbs that would fight the infection while allowing her to rest. As Eleanor drifted into a fevered sleep, he turned his attention to the immediate needs of their small group. The storm he had predicted was approaching. He could feel it in the air pressure, see it in the way the smoke from their fire eddied at the cave mouth. He secured the cave entrance with a framework of branches and the remaining canvas from Eleanor's wagon, creating a barrier that would block wind and snow while still allowing smoke to escape. James watched him work, the wolf cubs now sleeping in his lap. "Will Mama be okay?" the boy asked, his voice small in the cavern's darkness. Joseph considered lying, offering false comfort, but something about the child's steady gaze demanded honesty. "Your mother is very sick," he said carefully, "but she is also very strong. I will do everything I can to help her. You must be strong too and help care for the wolf cubs. They need you now, as you need your mother." James nodded, accepting this responsibility with a gravity beyond his years. "What are their names?" "They have no names yet. Among my people, names must be earned or discovered. Perhaps you will find the right names for them as you come to know them better." This seemed to satisfy the boy, who began speaking softly to the cubs, telling them about their journey and promising to take care of them. Joseph listened with half an ear while he prepared food, touched by the child's innocent faith that everything would work out. The storm arrived with full fury as darkness fell. Wind howled across the valley, driving snow in horizontal sheets that would have been deadly to anyone caught in the open. The canvas barrier bulged inward with each gust, but held firm. Inside the cave, the fire created a pocket of warmth and light that pushed back against the wilderness's assault. Joseph had made a thin soup from dried meat and the inner bark of pine trees, a survival food his people had used for generations. He managed to get James to eat a little, though the boy was more interested in making sure the wolf cubs got their share. The cubs were stronger now, able to lap weakened broth from a shallow bowl. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering in her delirium. Sometimes she called for her deceased husband. Sometimes she pleaded with faceless accusers, protesting her innocence of whatever curse they believed she carried. Joseph bathed her forehead with cool water and kept the fire burning steadily, knowing that the battle for her life would be fought tonight. As the storm raged, Joseph found himself telling James stories. Tales of the wolf spirit that guided. Lost travelers of the great bear that taught the people which berries were safe to eat. Of the clever coyote who could turn disasters into opportunities. The boy listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood more than his years might suggest. "Why did those people make us leave?" James asked suddenly, interrupting a story about the eagle who flew too close. "And to the sun." Joseph considered his answer carefully. "Sometimes fear makes people do cruel things," he said finally. "They didn't understand your mother, and what we don't understand, we often fear. But Mama didn't do anything wrong." "No, she didn't, but when bad things happen, people look for someone to blame. It's easier than accepting that sometimes the world is simply unpredictable." James digested this, petting the wolf cubs thoughtfully. "Will they come looking for us?" "No," Joseph said with certainty. "They believe they left your mother to die. They won't risk the storm to confirm what they think they already know." The boy seemed relieved by this answer. He yawned widely, the day's exhaustion finally catching up with him. Joseph prepared a sleeping place near the fire, using pine boughs and his own blanket to create a comfortable nest. James curled up with the wolf cubs, all three young creatures drawing comfort from each other's presence. As the night deepened, Eleanor's condition worsened. The fever raged through her body, and she tossed restlessly despite the herbs Joseph had given her. He kept vigil beside her, replacing cool cloths on her forehead and monitoring her breathing. Several times, he thought, they might lose her, but each time she rallied, as if sheer determination could overcome physical limitations. In her delirium, Eleanor spoke of many things. Her childhood in Pennsylvania, her courtship with Henry, their dreams of Western land where they could build a future. She spoke of the wagon train's gradual turning against her, the whispers that grew to accusations, the fear in people's eyes when they looked at her. "Not a witch," she mumbled at one point, her eyes unfocused. "Just unlucky. Henry said I brought him joy. Where's the curse in joy?" Joseph found himself moved by these glimpses into her life. Here was a woman who had lost everything yet still found compassion for orphaned wolf cubs. The contrast with those who had abandoned her could not have been starker. Near midnight, Eleanor's fever broke. Her breathing steadied, and the restless movements ceased. Joseph checked her pulse, finding it stronger and more regular. The infection hadn't been defeated, but her body was fighting back now, aided by the herbs and rest. He allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The worst of the storm seemed to be passing as well, the wind's howl diminishing to a more manageable moan. They had survived the first crisis, but Joseph knew greater challenges lay ahead. Eleanor would need weeks to fully recover, if she recovered at all. They would need food, medicine, and protection from both natural and human threats. But those were tomorrow's problems. Tonight, they were alive and sheltered. The fire crackled warmly. James slept peacefully with his unusual companions, and Eleanor's breathing had the rhythm of natural sleep rather than fevered unconsciousness. It was enough. Joseph added wood to the fire and settled back against the cave wall. Outside, snow continued to fall, adding another layer to the white blanket that would make tracking them impossible. The wagon train, if it had survived the storm in the pass, would be dealing with its own problems. Drake and the others would assume Eleanor and her son had perished, their conscience salved by the fiction that they had left her supplies and a chance. The irony wasn't lost on Joseph. In trying to rid themselves of a perceived curse, they had driven away one of their strongest members. Eleanor's survival instincts, her compassion even in extremity, her fierce devotion to her child, these were qualities that would have benefited the entire group. Instead, they had chosen superstition over substance, fear over fellowship. A sound from outside caught Joseph's attention. He tensed, hand moving to his knife, but relaxed when he identified it as the call of a great horned owl. The night hunters were abroad, life continuing its ancient patterns despite human dramas. The owl's presence was a good sign. It meant the worst of the storm had passed and normal activities were resuming. Eleanor stirred, her eyes opening briefly. For the first time since he'd started treating her, they seemed focused and aware. She looked around the cave, taking in the sleeping forms of James and the cubs, the fire, and Joseph keeping watch. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Rest," Joseph replied. "You're safe here, all of you." She nodded slightly and closed her eyes again, but her sleep now seemed peaceful rather than troubled. Joseph maintained his vigil as the night slowly turned toward dawn. The storm had tested them, but they had endured. Whatever came next, they would face it together, an unlikely family brought together by circumstances and bound by shared survival. The wind outside gentled to a whisper, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, not a threat, but a song of endurance, of life continuing against all odds. Joseph listened to its fading notes and thought about the strange paths that fate carved through the wilderness of human experience. Sometimes, what seemed like ending was actually beginning. Sometimes curses revealed themselves as blessings, and sometimes, in the darkest storms, unexpected guardians emerged to guide the lost toward hope. The silver dawn light filtered through the cave entrance, painting delicate patterns on the stone walls. Joseph stirred the embers of their fire, coaxing new flames from the glowing coals. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the world transformed under a pristine blanket of snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the early light. Eleanor's fever had broken just before sunrise, her skin cool to the touch for the first time since their arrival. Joseph checked her bandages, noting with satisfaction that the angry red streaks had begun to fade. The herbal poultice had done its work, drawing out the poison while she slept. Though still weak, she was clearly on the mend. James had fallen asleep, curled around the wolf cubs, all three young creatures finding comfort in shared warmth and companionship. The cubs had grown noticeably stronger during the night, their bellies full of broth and their bodies warm for the first time since losing their mother. One cub, slightly larger than its sibling, stirred and yawned, revealing tiny white teeth. Joseph prepared a fresh batch of medicinal tea, adding roots and berries he had gathered from the valley's secret stores. This place held many such gifts for those who knew where to look: edible plants that survived beneath the snow, healing herbs preserved in hidden caches, even dried meat carefully wrapped and stored in elevated platforms safe from predators. As he worked, Joseph reflected on the strange path that had brought him to this moment. He had set out 3 days ago simply to observe the wagon train, maintaining his usual watchful distance. Now he found himself guardian to a wounded woman, a small boy, and 2 orphaned wolf cubs, an unlikely family forged by circumstance and sealed by compassion. Eleanor stirred, her eyes opening slowly. For the first time since he'd found her, they were clear and focused. She looked around the cave, taking in the sleeping forms of James and the cubs, the carefully banked fire, and Joseph preparing breakfast. "How long?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. "You've slept through the night and the worst of the storm," Joseph replied, bringing her the steaming tea. "Your fever broke before dawn. The infection retreats." She accepted the cup gratefully, wincing as movement pulled at her shoulder. I remember fragments. You telling James stories, the wind howling like a living thing. Did I dream the wolf cubs or... Joseph smiled slightly. No dream. They're real enough and growing stronger. Your boy has appointed himself their protector. He speaks to them constantly as if they understand every word. Eleanor's eyes softened as she watched her sleeping son. He's always been like that with animals. Henry used to say James could charm birds from the trees if he set his mind to it. Her voice caught slightly at the mention of her late husband. Tell me about him, Joseph said quietly, settling back against the cave wall. Your husband, if you wish to speak of it. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, sipping the tea. When she spoke, her voice carried both sorrow and warmth. Henry was a dreamer. He read every account of the Oregon Territory he could find, convinced that our future lay in the West. He was a carpenter by trade, but his true gift was seeing possibility where others saw only hardship. She paused, lost in memory. We met at a church social in Philadelphia. I was serving punch, and he spilled an entire cup on his best shirt. He was so mortified, but he made me laugh with his attempts to clean it. 6 months later, we were married. Joseph listened without interrupting, understanding the need to speak of lost loved ones, to keep their memory alive through stories. The fever took him so quickly, Eleanor continued. One day he was planning our route west. The next he could barely breathe. The doctor said his lungs were full of fluid. Nothing could be done. She closed her eyes briefly. His last words were about the land waiting for us in Oregon. He made me promise to continue the journey. And so you have, Joseph observed, despite all obstacles. Eleanor's jaw set with familiar determination. I won't let his dream die. James deserves the future his father envisioned, even if Henry can't share it with us. The conversation was interrupted by movement from the pile of sleeping children and cubs. James sat up, rubbing his eyes, the wolf cubs immediately seeking the warmth he'd provided. One cub, the smaller of the two, made a small whimpering sound that turned into something almost like a purr when James stroked its fur. Mama! James exclaimed, seeing his mother awake. You're better! Much better, sweetheart, Eleanor assured him, though Joseph could see the effort it took to project strength. Thanks to Mr. Two Feathers and his medicine. James looked at Joseph with something approaching awe. He knows everything about the mountains, Mama, and the stories he tells, about Eagle Brother and Coyote Sister and the first snow. Joseph felt unexpected warmth at the child's enthusiasm. His own children were older now, past the age of wonderment at their father's tales. It had been years since young eyes had looked at him with such complete trust. Perhaps you'd like to help me gather firewood, Joseph suggested to James. The storm has passed, and we need to build up our supplies. James looked to his mother for permission. At her nod, he carefully transferred the wolf cubs to her lap, showing the same gentle handling Joseph had taught him. The cubs protested briefly at the disruption, but settled against Eleanor's warmth. As Joseph and James ventured outside, the boy gasped at the transformed landscape. The storm had deposited nearly 3 feet of fresh snow, turning the valley into a pristine wilderness that seemed untouched by human presence. Ice crystals hung from every branch, catching the morning light in tiny rainbows. It's so beautiful, James whispered, as if speaking loudly might shatter the spell. Beauty and danger often walk hand in hand in these mountains, Joseph replied, scanning the tree line automatically. The same storm that creates this wonder can end lives in moments. Respect must always accompany appreciation. They worked together, gathering deadwood from beneath protective overhangs where the snow hadn't reached. Joseph showed James how to identify which wood would burn well and which would only smoke, how to shake snow from branches without getting soaked, how to carry a proper load without straining young muscles. As they worked, Joseph noticed fresh tracks in the snow. Deer had passed through the valley during the night, and he spotted the delicate prints of snowshoe hares. But it was another set of tracks that made him pause. Wolf prints, larger than those of the cub's mother, circling the valley's perimeter. "Are those from the puppy's family?" James asked, noticing Joseph's attention to the tracks. Joseph knelt beside the prints, measuring them with his hand. "These are from an adult wolf, but not the mother. Males typically have larger paws." He studied the pattern carefully. This one was alone, investigating, perhaps looking for the female who was killed. James's face fell. "The mama wolf is really gone?" "Yes," Joseph said gently. "Hunters from your wagon train killed her before the storm, but her cubs live because of your mother's kindness. In nature, death and life are always intertwined." And they returned to the cave with armloads of wood to find Eleanor sitting up properly, the wolf cubs playing with a piece of leather she'd given them. Color had returned to her cheeks, though she still moved carefully. "They're getting playful," she said with a smile. "The larger one is quite the little wrestler." Joseph built up the fire while James excitedly told his mother about the animal, tracks and the ice crystals and everything else he'd observed. The cave filled with warmth and the comfortable sounds of family conversation, a stark contrast to the howling chaos of the previous night. As the morning progressed, Joseph prepared a more substantial meal using supplies from the cache. He showed Eleanor and James how his people stored food for emergencies. Dried berries sealed in bark containers, pemmican wrapped in hide, even nuts gathered from secret groves and preserved in clay vessels. "Generations of my people have added to these stores," he explained, unwrapping a portion of dried meat. "We take what we need and replace what we can, ensuring the valley remains a refuge for those who might need it." Eleanor watched him work with fascination. "It's like a library of survival knowledge, written in food and supplies instead of words." Joseph nodded, pleased by her understanding. "Exactly. Each contribution tells a story. This pemmican recipe belonged to my grandmother. These herbs were first cached by my uncle, a renowned healer. The valley remembers all who seek shelter here." As they ate, Joseph outlined their situation with careful honesty. "The storm has blocked the high passes completely. It will be weeks before travel becomes possible, perhaps longer. This valley can sustain us, but we must be prepared for an extended stay." Eleanor absorbed this news quietly. "What about your family? Won't they worry?" "My wife knows I sometimes range far in my wanderings. She won't expect me back for another moon cycle. By then, the passes might be clear enough for careful travel." He paused, considering. "The greater challenge will be deciding our course once spring arrives." "What do you mean?" Joseph chose his words carefully. "The wagon train believes you dead. They won't return or search for you. This gives you options. You could continue to Oregon as planned, though without the protection of a group. You could return east, though that journey has its own perils. Or, Eleanor prompted when he paused. "Or you could consider a path entirely. My people would welcome you, especially given the circumstances. The cubs you saved are seen as sacred by our tribe. Their preservation would be viewed as a sign." Eleanor looked down at the wolf cubs, now sleeping again after their play. "I made a promise to my husband. Oregon was his dream for James. Dreams can take new shapes without betraying their essence," Joseph observed. "What matters is the spirit of the promise, not its exact form. Your husband dreamed of a better life for his son. That can be found in many places." They fell silent, each contemplating the future. Outside, the sun climbed higher, its rays finding their way into the cave to paint golden patches on the floor. The wolf cubs stirred in their sleep, perhaps dreaming of their lost mother or the warmth they'd found with their human protectors. James, with the resilience of childhood, had already adapted to their new circumstances. He chatted happily about the wolf cubs, wondering aloud what to name them, planning adventures they would have together. His innocent acceptance of the situation reminded Joseph of how adaptable humans could be when necessity demanded it. As the day wore on, Joseph continued Eleanor's treatment, changing her bandages and applying fresh poultices. The wound was healing cleanly now, though it would leave a scar, a permanent reminder of the cruelty that had driven her to this refuge. "I've been thinking about what you said," Eleanor spoke suddenly as he worked. "About the wagon train, believing us dead. It feels strange to be mourned by people who wanted us gone." "They mourn their idea of you, not who you truly are," Joseph replied. "They'll tell themselves stories to ease their conscience, that you wandered off, that you ignored warnings, that fate took its course. The truth would challenge their actions, so they'll reshape it." Eleanor's eyes flashed with familiar fire. "Let them think what they will. I know the truth. James knows. You know. That's enough." Joseph smiled at her spirit. "Spoken like a true survivor. My grandmother would have liked you. She used to say that the strongest trees are those that bend without breaking, that find ways to grow despite the harshest winds." Asai, that afternoon, while Eleanor rested, Joseph took James to explore more of the valley. He showed the boy the hot springs that kept parts of the stream ice-free, the caves where bears had denned in seasons past, the ancient pictographs his ancestors had carved into protected rock faces. "These symbols tell our history," he explained, tracing the weathered shapes with his finger. "This spiral represents the cycle of seasons. These figures show the first people who found this valley, and here. These are the wolf spirits that guide and protect." James studied the symbols with intense concentration. "Will you teach me to read them? If your mother permits, yes. But remember, knowledge carries responsibility. What you learn must be respected, not treated as mere curiosity." The boy nodded solemnly. "I promise. Mama says promises are sacred." They returned to find Eleanor attempting to stand, frustrated by her weakness. The wolf cubs watched her struggles with tilted heads, as if puzzled by human determination to walk upright when four legs seemed so much more stable. "You're pushing too hard," Joseph cautioned, moving to support her. "I can't lie still forever," Eleanor protested. "There's work to be done, preparations to make. We can't simply exist on your people's stored supplies." Joseph helped her to a sitting position against the cave wall. "Healing is also work. Your body fights a battle as real as any warrior's combat. Honor that fight by giving it the resources it needs." Eleanor's expression softened. "You sound like Henry. He always said I tried to carry the world on my shoulders." Perhaps he was wise. The world is too heavy for any one person. That's why we form communities, families, tribes, to share the weight. As evening approached, they settled into what was becoming a routine. Joseph prepared the evening meal, while Eleanor helped James practice basic words in Shoshone. The wolf cubs had grown bold enough to explore the cave, though they always returned to James's side when startled by unfamiliar sounds. "What shall we call them?" James asked, watching the cubs play fight over a stick. "They need names," Joseph considered. "In our tradition, names often come from observing behavior or recognizing spirits. What do you see in them?" James studied the cubs intently. The larger one was more aggressive in play, always initiating their mock battles. The smaller cub was quicker, more agile, dodging and weaving around its siblings' charges. "The big one is brave," James decided, "like the stories about warriors, and the small one dances away from trouble." Then perhaps brave heart for the larger and swift dancer for the smaller, Joseph suggested. "In my language, that would be Sonkpe Chante and Inali Wachi." James tried to repeat the words, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. Eleanor helped him practice, and soon he was calling each cub by its Shoshone name, delighting in the way they seemed to respond. As darkness fell, Joseph built up the fire and began another story. This one told of a great blizzard that had trapped a family in the mountains, and how they survived by learning from the animals around them, storing food like squirrels, sheltering like bears, hunting like wolves. Did they ever return to their people? James asked sleepily. They did, but they were changed. They brought back knowledge that helped their tribe survive many harsh winters. Sometimes being separated from our path teaches us things we couldn't learn any other way. Eleanor met Joseph's eyes over her son's head, understanding the parallel. Their forced isolation might yet prove a blessing in disguise, teaching them strengths they didn't know they possessed. The fire crackled softly as the story concluded. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars visible through the cave entrance like distant campfires in the void. Somewhere in the forest, a wolf howled. Perhaps the lone male whose tracks they'd seen, still searching for his lost mate. The sound made the cubs stir, their ears pricking forward. Some ancestral memory seemed to awaken in them, a recognition of their wild heritage despite their newfound domestic comfort. James gathered them closer, as if to reassure them they belonged here now, with this strange pack of humans who had chosen to preserve their lives. Joseph watched this interaction thoughtfully. The boundaries between wild and tame, between human and animal, were more fluid than most people realized. These cubs would grow up straddling both worlds, neither fully wolf nor fully pet, much like Eleanor and James themselves, caught between their past life and an uncertain future. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "if you feel strong enough, I'll show you how to set snares for small game. We should supplement our supplies with fresh meat when possible." Eleanor nodded. "I want to contribute. You've done so much already." "You contribute by surviving, by healing, by showing your son that strength comes in many forms. But yes, I'll teach you our hunting methods. Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied." As they prepared for sleep, the cave felt less like a shelter and more like a home. The wolf cubs curled between James and Eleanor. The fire burned steadily, and the familiar sounds of wind and wildlife filtered through the entrance. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, an unlikely pack bound by circumstance and choice. Joseph took the first watch, as was his habit. He sat near the cave entrance, rifle across his knees, listening to the night sounds of the valley. His thoughts drifted to his own family, to the choices that had led him here, to the mysterious ways fate wove its patterns through human lives. In the firelight, he could see Eleanor's face relaxed in sleep, the lines of pain and worry smoothed away. James clutched one of the wolf cubs like a favored toy, both child and animal breathing in synchronized rhythm. The scene struck him as perfectly natural, as if this arrangement of humans and wolves sharing warmth and protection was how things were meant to be. A shooting star streaked across the visible patch of sky, and Joseph made a quiet prayer to the spirits of this place. He asked for continued protection, for wisdom in the decisions ahead, and for the strength to guide these refugees toward whatever destiny awaited them. The night deepened, bringing with it the profound silence that only snow-covered mountains can produce. In this silence, Joseph found a peace that had eluded him in recent years. Perhaps this unexpected detour from his normal path was exactly where he was meant to be. The spirits worked in mysterious ways, after all. As the fire burned lower, he added another log, ensuring warmth would last through the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new adaptations to their strange situation. But tonight, in this ancient refuge, they were safe. They were together, and sometimes that was miracle enough. The wolf cubs stirred in their sleep, perhaps dreaming of their mother or the wildlife they'd never fully know. James murmured something unintelligible, and pulled them closer. Eleanor's breathing remained deep and even, her body finally getting the rest it needed to complete its healing. Joseph settled back against the cave wall, his trained senses alert even as his mind wandered. He thought about the tracks he'd seen, both animal and human. The wagon train had likely made it through the pass before the worst of the storm, but they would have struggled. Drake would be dealing with the consequences of his decision, whether he admitted it or not. But that was their path to walk. Here in this valley, a different story was unfolding. One of survival against odds, of compassion transcending species boundaries, of new families forming from the fragments of loss. It was a story as old as humanity itself, yet unique in its particulars. The stars wheeled overhead, marking time's passage in their ancient dance. Joseph marked their positions automatically, reading the sky like a vast clock. Dawn was still hours away, but already he was planning the day ahead, checking trap lines, gathering medicinal plants, teaching James to recognize edible roots beneath the snow. Each day would build on the last, creating a foundation of knowledge and trust. Eleanor would grow stronger, James would become more confident in his wilderness skills, and the wolf cubs would mature into what? That remained to be seen. Like all futures, theirs was unwritten, full of possibility and peril in equal measure. But that was tomorrow's concern. Tonight, the fire burned bright, the cave was warm, and his unlikely charges were safe. The grand tapestry of existence, this small scene of cross-species cooperation and human kindness, might seem insignificant. But Joseph knew better. Such moments were the threads from which the fabric of hope was woven. He adjusted his rifle and continued his vigil, guardian of this small circle of life in the vast wilderness. Outside, the night continued its slow journey toward dawn, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings and the eternal possibility of redemption. In the years to come, the story of the woman who saved wolf cubs during a blizzard would become legend among his people. But for now, it was simply life as it was being lived, raw, uncertain, and shot through with unexpected grace. Joseph smiled slightly at the thought and settled in for the long watch ahead. The fire crackled softly, sending spirals of smoke up through the carefully constructed vent. Outside, a gentle wind stirred the pine branches, creating a whispered lullaby that spoke of endurance, adaptation, and the endless creativity of survival. In this ancient refuge, old as the mountains themselves, a new chapter was being written in the ongoing story of human and animal kinship. And so, the night passed marked by the steady breathing of sleepers, the occasional pop of burning wood, and the quiet vigilance of a guardian who understood that sometimes the most profound acts of heroism came not in grand gestures, but in the simple decision to keep watch while others rested, to maintain hope when circumstances seemed hopeless, and to extend protection to the vulnerable, regardless of species or circumstance. Spring arrived in the Wind River Mountains like a hesitant guest, one tentative step at a time. The deep snows that had trapped them in the valley began their slow retreat, revealing patches of earth that seemed impossibly green after months of white. Streams swollen with snowmelt sang their ancient songs, and the first wildflowers pushed through the remaining snow with defiant beauty. Eleanor stood at the cave entrance, watching the transformation with wonder. Her shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a pale scar as testament to that terrible October day. The woman who gazed out at the awakening valley bore little resemblance to the desperate mother who had stumbled into this refuge months ago. Her face had been touched by wind and weather, her hands roughened by the work of survival. But her eyes held a peace that had been absent before. James played nearby with the wolf cubs, though they could hardly be called cubs anymore. At 6 months old, they had grown into lanky adolescents, all legs and oversized paws. Brave Heart, the larger male, had developed a magnificent silver-gray coat, while Swift Dancer displayed the tawny browns and blacks of her mother. They moved with the fluid grace of their kind, yet responded to James's calls with the devotion of domestic dogs. "They'll need to choose soon," Joseph observed, joining Eleanor at the entrance. His voice carried the quiet wisdom she had come to treasure over their months together. "The wild calls to them more strongly each day," Eleanor nodded, having noticed the same restlessness in the young wolves. They would stand at the valley's edge at twilight, noses lifted to catch scents from the greater wilderness, their bodies trembling with ancestral memories. Yet they always returned to James, torn between two worlds. "As must we all choose," she replied softly, understanding the parallel. The past months had been a time of transformation for all of them. Under Joseph's patient guidance, Eleanor had learned skills she never imagined possessing. She could now track deer through fresh snow, set snares for rabbits, identify edible plants, and prepare herbal remedies. James had blossomed into a child of two cultures, speaking Shoshone as readily as English, moving through the forest with the quiet confidence Joseph had instilled. They had survived the depths of winter through cooperation and ingenuity. When blizzards howled outside, they had huddled together in the cave, sharing stories and warmth. Joseph had taught them the winter tales of his people, how coyotes stole fire for humanity, how the stars were placed in the sky, why the mountains reached toward heaven. Eleanor had reciprocated with Bible stories and fairy tales from her childhood, creating a tapestry of narratives that enriched them all. The young wolves had been integral to their survival in unexpected ways. Their keen senses had alerted the humans to approaching storms, and their presence had deterred other predators from investigating the cave. Once, when James had wandered too far during a gathering expedition, it was Swift Dancer who had led them to him, the bond between boy and wolf proving stronger than any training. "A messenger comes," Joseph said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the tree line. Eleanor followed his gaze and saw a figure emerging from the forest, a Shoshone warrior on horseback, leading a second mount. She recognized him as Thomas Running Bear, Joseph's younger brother, who had visited twice during the winter months to bring supplies and news. Thomas dismounted with fluid grace, his face grave. He spoke rapidly in Shoshone to Joseph, gesturing toward the east. Eleanor caught enough words to understand the essence: the wagon train, survivors, questions being asked in the nearest settlement. Joseph's expression darkened as he listened. When Thomas finished, Joseph turned to Eleanor. "The wagon train made it through the pass, but at great cost. They lost 6 wagons and 12 people to the storms. Samuel Drake survived, but his authority is broken. They wintered at Fort Bridger, and now there are inquiries." "Inquiries?" Eleanor felt a chill despite the spring warmth. "About you, about what truly happened. Alice Drake spoke out against her father during the worst of the winter. Others began to question the story they had been told. A territorial marshal has been asking questions." Eleanor absorbed this news with mixed emotions. Part of her felt vindication that the truth was emerging. Another part recoiled from the thought of returning to that world of accusation and judgment. "There's more," Joseph continued. "Margaret Foster survived the winter, but took ill with lung fever. Before she died, she gave testimony to the marshal about what happened to you. She said she couldn't meet her maker without speaking the truth." Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes at the thought of the elderly woman who had shown her kindness. May she rest in peace. Thomas spoke again, and Joseph translated. "My brother says the marshal wants to bring charges against Drake for attempted murder, but they need your testimony. They believe you dead, of course, but if you were to appear..." "Oi!" The implications hung heavy in the air. Eleanor looked at James, still playing with the wolves, blissfully unaware of the conversation. She thought of the life they had built here, the peace they had found, the new family they had formed. Then she thought of justice, of truth, of the other families who might suffer under Drake's leadership. I need time to think, she said finally. Joseph nodded. Thomas will stay the night. You need not decide immediately. That evening, as they shared a meal of fresh trout and early greens, the conversation was subdued. James sensed the tension and stayed close to his mother, the wolves, flanking him protectively. After the meal, Joseph took Thomas aside for a private conversation while Eleanor tucked James into his sleeping furs. "Mama, are we leaving?" James asked with the uncanny perception of children. Eleanor smoothed his hair, still unsure of her. "Answer. Maybe, sweetheart. Would that make you sad?" James considered this seriously. "I'd miss the cave, and Joseph, and the valley." He paused, then added, "But Braveheart and Swift Dancer would come with us, wouldn't they?" Eleanor's heart ached at his innocence. The wolves couldn't follow them back to civilization, and she knew James would have to face that heartbreak eventually. "We'll see, my love. Now, sleep." She sat by her son until his breathing deepened, then joined Joseph and Thomas by the fire. The brothers had been discussing options, and Joseph presented them to her with characteristic directness. "Three paths lie before you," he said. "First, you could return to face Drake and testify. Justice would likely be served, but you would also face scrutiny and possible danger from his supporters. Second, you could continue to Oregon as originally planned. My brother knows guides who could take you safely, avoiding the settlements, where you might be recognized." "And the third?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she knew. "Remain here, or rather come with us to our summer village. My people have discussed this throughout the winter. The signs are clear to them. A white woman who saves wolf cubs, who survives against all odds, who learns our ways with respect. They believe you were sent to us for a purpose." Eleanor stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. Each path pulled at different parts of her heart. Justice called her back. Her promise to Henry urged her forward to Oregon. But the peace she had found here, the sense of belonging, the new understanding of herself, these argued for staying. "What about James?" she asked. "What future would he have among your people?" "A good one," Joseph assured her. "He would be raised as one of us, but with knowledge of both worlds. Such children often become bridges between peoples, translators not just of language, but of understanding. And the wolves can't come with us if we leave," Eleanor finished. "I know, but here they could remain part of your family for as long as they choose. Our people understand the balance between wild and tame. The wolves would be free to leave when their nature calls, but also welcome to return." That night, Eleanor lay awake listening to the spring wind and the distant howl of wild wolves. The young wolves stirred at the sound, but settled again, their loyalty to James still stronger than the call of their kind. She thought about paths and choices, about promises and new possibilities. In the morning, she found Joseph preparing for a hunt. "I've decided," she announced. He paused in checking his bow, waiting. "I will return to give testimony," she said. "Not for revenge, but for truth. Margaret Foster deserves that much. The other families deserve to know what kind of man they followed." She took a breath. "But after that, I want to come back. If your people will have us." Joseph smiled, the expression transforming his usually grave features. "They will. You have already proven yourself. The rest is formality. And James, the wolves, we will keep them safe here while you travel. James is young enough to adapt to a temporary separation, and the wolves need time to grow stronger before facing such choices. When you return, we will be here." The next days were a flurry of preparation. Eleanor practiced her story with Thomas, who would accompany her as translator and witness. Joseph crafted a detailed map showing her exact location when abandoned, the path they had taken to the valley, and other evidence that would support her testimony. The hardest part was explaining to James. He clung to her when she told him, tears streaming down his face. "Why can't I come? Why can't Joseph come? Why can't brave heart and swift dancer come?" Eleanor held him close, her own tears falling. "Because this is something I must do alone, my brave boy. But I promise on your father's memory that I will come back. Joseph will take care of you, and you'll take care of the wolves. Can you do that for me?" James nodded against her chest, trying to be strong. That night, he slept between the two wolves, drawing comfort from their warmth and steady breathing. The morning of departure dawned clear and bright. Eleanor dressed in a combination of her own mended clothes and Shoshone garments, a visual representation of her transformed self. She carried letters Joseph had written to military authorities, explaining his role as witness to the aftermath of her abandonment. At the valley entrance, James broke away from Joseph and ran to her one last time. She knelt to embrace him, whispering promises of return. The wolves circled them, whining softly, their golden eyes reflecting an understanding beyond their years. 2 moons, Joseph said, using the Shoshone measure of time. "In 2 moons, the summer gathering begins. We will look for you there." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. She mounted the horse Thomas had brought, took a last look at the valley that had sheltered them, at the small boy flanked by young wolves, at the man who had saved their lives and shown them a new way of being. Then she turned and rode away, following Thomas down the mountain path. The journey to Fort Bridger took 5 days. Eleanor rode in silence much of the time, processing all that had happened, preparing for what was to come. Thomas proved a thoughtful companion, sharing stories of his own family and helping her understand more about the culture she was choosing to join. Fort Bridger buzzed with activity when they arrived. The marshal, a weathered man named John Garrison, nearly fell off his chair when Eleanor walked into his office. "Mrs. Whitman, but we were told," Drake said. "Mr. Drake said what he wished to be true," Eleanor replied calmly. "I'm here to tell you what actually happened." The testimony took 2 days. Eleanor recounted every detail: the growing hostility of the wagon train, the accusations of bringing bad luck, Drake's final ultimatum, the shot he fired as she tried to follow. She showed the scar on her shoulder, presented Joseph's written statement, and answered endless questions with quiet dignity. Drake was arrested the next day. When confronted with Eleanor's survival and testimony, his bluster crumbled. Others came forward with their own stories of his harsh leadership and questionable decisions. Alice Drake wept when she saw Eleanor, embracing her and begging forgiveness for not doing more. "You were a child," Eleanor told her gently, "and you spoke up when it mattered. That took courage." The legal proceedings would continue for months, but Eleanor's part was done. She had spoken her truth, honored Margaret Foster's memory, and ensured that future wagon trains would be warned about the dangers of unchecked authority and superstitious fear. A week later, she began the journey back to the valley. This time, she rode with confidence, knowing the path, understanding the land in ways she never had before. Thomas accompanied her partway, then bid farewell at a crossroads where Joseph waited. "You return," Joseph said simply, but his eyes showed deep satisfaction. "I promised," Eleanor replied, "and I had to know if this was truly my choice or just an escape. Now I know." They rode together through landscapes that had once seemed foreign, but now felt like home. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking the valley, Eleanor's heart soared. Below, she could see James in the meadow, throwing sticks for the wolves to chase. Even at this distance, she could see how they'd grown. James must have sensed something, because he suddenly looked up toward the ridge. His joyous cry echoed across the valley. "Mama! Mama's home!" He ran toward them with the wolves loping alongside, and Eleanor dismounted to catch him in her arms. The reunion was a tangle of tears and laughter, with Braveheart and Swift Dancer circling them in excitement, their tails wagging like domestic dogs despite their wild appearance. That evening, as they sat around the fire, James recounted everything that had happened in her absence. How Swift Dancer had caught her first rabbit, how Braveheart had warned them of a bear passing through the valley, how Joseph had taught him to make arrows. "And I kept my promise, Mama," he said proudly. "I took care of them just like you asked." Eleanor hugged him close. "You did perfectly, my brave boy." Later, when James slept with the wolves curled around him, Eleanor and Joseph sat in companionable silence. Finally she spoke. "The summer gathering, will it be difficult? A white woman among your people?" "Some will question," Joseph admitted, "but most already know your story. The saving of the wolf cubs carries great weight. In our traditions, wolves are teachers, guides between worlds. That you preserved their lives when your own was threatened. This speaks to something deeper than blood or birth." "And you?" Eleanor asked. "What does it speak to you?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment. "My wife died 3 winters ago," he said finally. "I thought my heart had gone with her to the spirit world. But watching you fight for life, seeing your devotion to your son, witnessing your respect for our ways, my heart remembers how to hope." Eleanor reached out and took his hand. No more words were needed. The summer gathering of Joseph's people took place in a broad valley where 3 rivers met. Hundreds of lodges formed a great circle, with smoke from cooking fires rising into the clear mountain air. Eleanor rode in with Joseph's family group, James before her on the saddle, the young wolves padding alongside despite curious looks from other dogs. The reception was mixed, as Joseph had predicted. Some welcomed her warmly, having heard the story of the wolf mother who chose their ways. Others remained distant, watchful, needing time to judge for themselves. The crucial moment came when the tribal council convened to formally discuss her place among them. Eleanor stood before the gathered elders, James beside her, the wolves sitting alertly at their flanks. She spoke in careful Shoshone, telling her story once more, explaining her choice to return, expressing her desire to learn and contribute. When she finished, the eldest woman present rose. Speaking River was ancient, her face mapped with countless wrinkles, her eyes holding the wisdom of many seasons. She walked slowly to Eleanor, studying her intently. Then she reached out and touched the scar on Eleanor's shoulder. "This mark," Speaking River said, her voice carrying despite its frailty, "shows where your old life tried to kill you, but you lived. The wolf cubs lived. This is power medicine." She turned to address the council. "The spirits send us teachers in many forms. Who are we to refuse their gifts?" The debate continued, but Speaking River's words carried weight. When the vote came, the decision was overwhelming. Eleanor and James would be adopted into the tribe, with Joseph as their sponsor and guide. That night, the celebration feast included a naming ceremony. Eleanor received the name Wolf Mother Who Lived, while James became Boy Who Speaks with Wolves. As drums beat and voices rose in ancient songs, Eleanor felt something settle deep in her spirit, a sense of rightness, of finding her place in the great web of existence. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Joseph led Eleanor and James to a quiet spot overlooking the river. The young wolves followed, moving like shadows in the moonlight. "There's something more," Joseph said. "Something I should have told you sooner." Eleanor tensed, but his expression was gentle. "What is it?" The lone wolf tracks we saw that first morning, I knew who made them. His name is Grey Thunder, the mate of the female who was killed. He's been watching over his cubs all winter, staying distant but making sure they were protected. As if summoned by his words, a shape materialized from the darkness. An enormous male wolf, his coat silver in the moonlight, stood at the edge of the firelight. Braveheart and Swift Dancer immediately perked up, their bodies quivering with recognition. "He's come to claim them," Eleanor whispered, understanding flooding through her. "Match, their real father." "Yes, but watch." The male wolf approached slowly, dignified and cautious. He went first to his cubs, sniffing them thoroughly, seemingly satisfied with their health. Then, to Eleanor's amazement, he approached her. For a long moment, human and wolf regarded each other. Then Grey Thunder did something unprecedented. He lowered his massive head and gently touched his nose to Eleanor's outstretched hand. "He thanks you," Joseph translated the gesture, "and he offers a choice. The cubs can go with him to live wild, or they can stay with their human family. He will honor either decision." Eleanor looked at James, seeing the struggle in his young face. He loved the wolves desperately, but he also understood their true nature. "What do you think they want?" James asked in a small voice. Eleanor knelt beside the young wolves, looking into their intelligent eyes. "I think they want what we all want, to belong to both worlds, to be free to choose." Joseph nodded approvingly. "In our tradition, some wolves live between the wild and the village. They hunt with our people sometimes, run with their pack at others. It's not common, but it happens when the bond is strong enough." Eleanor stood, addressing Grey Thunder directly. "They are your children, but they are also family to my son. Can we share them?" The great wolf seemed to consider this. He turned to his offspring, communicating in ways beyond human understanding. Braveheart and Swift Dancer responded with soft whines and body language that spoke volumes. Finally, Grey Thunder threw back his head and howled, a long, haunting sound that raised goosebumps on human skin. From the darkness, answering howls rose, revealing that a whole pack waited nearby. "He agrees," Joseph said with wonder. "This is unprecedented. You've created a bridge between worlds." In the days that followed, the young wolves began spending time with their father's pack, learning to hunt properly, understanding their true heritage. But they always returned to James, maintaining their bond with their human family. It became a source of wonder in the tribe, the boy who ran with wolves, the mother who bridged worlds. As summer turned to autumn, Eleanor found her place in the rhythms of tribal life. She learned to prepare hides, gather medicines, and contribute to the community in countless ways. Her skills as a seamstress, developed in her former life, proved valuable in new contexts. James thrived, growing strong and confident, moving seamlessly between his two heritages. The relationship between Eleanor and Joseph deepened naturally, like a river finding its course. When he formally courted her according to tribal custom, no one was surprised. Their joining ceremony took place as the aspens turned gold, with James beaming beside them and two half-grown wolves sitting alert at their sides. That winter, when the snows returned to the mountains, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. They named her Mary Song of Two Worlds, and she was welcomed as a symbol of the bridge their unusual family represented. Years passed, marked by the turning of seasons and the growth of children. James became a skilled hunter and translator, respected for his ability to move between native and white settlements. He helped negotiate peaceful passages for wagon trains, preventing the kind of tragedy that had marked his own early experience. Braveheart and Swift Dancer continued their dual existence, sometimes running wild with Grey Thunder's pack, other times returning to stay near their human family. They mated with pack members and raised cubs of their own, some of whom inherited their parents' comfort with humans. Eleanor never returned to the East, never saw Oregon, but she found something better, a life lived in harmony with the land and its creatures, a family bound by choice rather than blood alone, a purpose greater than mere survival. When wagon trains passed through the territory, travelers sometimes spoke of seeing a white woman dressed in native clothing, accompanied by wolves that seemed almost tame. The stories grew in the telling, becoming legend. The woman who was left to die but chose to live, who saved wolf cubs and was saved in return, who found her true home in the wilderness, among people who judged her by her heart rather than her heritage. In her final years, Eleanor often sat at the same cave entrance where she had spent that desperate winter, watching her grandchildren play while half-wild wolves lounged nearby. She would think about the paths life offers, about the choices that seem like endings but prove to be beginnings, about the families we're born into and the ones we create. When curious visitors asked about her story, she would smile and say, "I was lost and was found. I was abandoned and discovered family. I saved 2 lives and gained 100. Sometimes the storm that threatens to destroy us only blows us toward our true home." As the sun set over the Wind River Mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Eleanor would gather her family close, Joseph steady at her side, children and grandchildren filling the circle, wolves padding silently at the edges. Together they would watch the light fade, listening to the eternal song of the wilderness, grateful for the unexpected paths that had brought them together. In the end, Eleanor Whitman's grave marker bore 2 names, the one she was born with and the one she earned. Wolf Mother who lived. But her true memorial lived on in the generations who carried her story, in the bonds between human and animal she had helped forge, and in the truth that sometimes our greatest trials lead us not away from home, but toward it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.